Welcome to the Time for a Reset podcast, the podcast where I, Paul Frampton, interview senior marketers on the big issues of the day and the thing that they want to see reset with an ever-changing landscape. Good afternoon and welcome back to another episode of Time for a Reset. This afternoon, I'm delighted to be joined by Ellie Norman. Ellie was most recently the global CMO for Formula One. So probably on an aeroplane or a helicopter most weekends of the year, I'm guessing, Ellie.
I was certainly more than one weekend away a year, that's for sure.
I can imagine. So we're delighted to have Ellie here. As I said, she ran kind of F1 for 5 years. Prior to that, she led marketing at Virgin Media. And prior to that, she led comms across Europe for Honda. She's also an NED for Marketing Society and speaks on many of the kind of marketing stages. So we're really delighted to have Ellie here. And we're going to jump straight in. Ellie, the first question we always like to ask is, what would you like to hit reset on? If you had a big button on your table right now, what would you change in the marketing industry?
Oh, great question to start with. First of all, brilliant to be with you, Paul. So thank you. And equally super, as I'm now the former sort of CMO of F1, to be joining you from home. So that makes a nice change. What would I press reset on? I'm a huge fan of clearly delivering a return for a business, but I think marketing has become so short-termism. And I think actually pressing reset on really finding the balance between the long and the short of it, and really kind of focusing on that sort of horizon and actually how you build brands. And by building a brand, you can still deliver the sales overnight as well. So I'd love to kind of reset that and bring back a longer term view, way more kind of context versus actually the sort of short term efficient driving focus that we seem to see a lot of tactics delivering on now.
Right. The rise of performance marketing, shifting everything to the bottom of the funnel, that
yeah.
kind of thing.
And marketing is just marketing, right? So the question is really about what are you measuring and over what time frame? It's not that one does performance marketing, one doesn't do performance marketing. All 100%. Marketing is there to perform.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it feels like it's a raging debate that kind of rears its head in most, whenever you get most senior marketing leaders around the table, there's this frustration that we've siloed and created these different parts of the industry. Whereas, as you said, marketing is there generally to be the growth engine for a business, and it is the long and the short of it. It's the combination of those things rather than we're not going to do that. We're not going to build a brand. We're not going to invest in that. We're just going to do some stuff that drives footfall or people to a race or whatever it will be.
It's always, for me, it's always about and versus or, and just how do you kind of blend the channels together to deliver on, a clear strategy to reach the kind of audience. And it will be that blend or a graphic equalizer that you need to kind of turn up or down. But it is never just one singular thing.
Right. Nice. I like the graphic equalizer metaphor. And how do you think this is going to become more challenging as we head fairly inevitably into a global recession? I mean, 10% inflation, and there seems to be cost of living issues all over the place. So how difficult is it for a brand to stick to that kind of strategy in these times?
I think the pressure is on, and it really, I think, requires voices around your board table to really sort of assess and review what is required. Because for all business, fundamentally, you require kind of profit and you need your kind of cash flows. Okay, so there's always going to be an element of what can you deliver in the sort of short term, and how do you do that as effectively as possible. There's also so much research and insight from the marketing greats like sort of Field and Binet, literally around typically having a combination of the long and the short of it, or even Bar and Sharp as well about your SOV and stuff. So it really is about how do you have that conversation, I think, around a board table in a language that works for your business to really sort of understand that this is also an opportunity to really sort of hold your nerve and to invest in that longer term kind of brand building, because we see these cycles come around sort of every decade.
Absolutely.
And for those of us that have been in these cycles kind of once or twice before, it's actually how do you hold your nerve and continue to have some of that brand investment? Because inevitably when economy starts to kind of bounce back, which it will, to have the salience and to be primed on that front of mind, you absolutely want customers to be selecting you and kind of spending with you, whether that's a kind of product or service. Now that's really, really hard to do. And it requires obviously big relationships founded on kind of trust and a credible kind of proven track record. But if you are in a position to do that within an organization, I think we've seen time and time again when brands or companies have done that, they typically outperform their peer group on the S&P 500.
Yeah, no, absolutely, well said. And I think you remind us that zooming out and thinking about these cycles and the fact that they've happened before is a really good thing, because I think recency bias takes us into, this is the first time it's ever been this bad, and we're post-COVID, and there's too much that we can never learn from history on. And I also like that point you made around, at the end of the day, the goals for a business rarely change. You still want to sell stuff or generate revenue. So that hasn't changed. So there's a surefire way of not doing that is by cutting investment that's getting you in front of people and getting people to think differently. So it's interesting how, just from a finance perspective, quite often they will look at the P&L. What are the things that are easily kind of removed? Because you can't easily remove talent cost. You can't easily change the cost of offices. But marketing is a variable cost. So I suppose it does, to your point, require there to be the right conversations at the board table. And do you think that marketing is less or more important around a board table than it was, say 5 years ago?
I've got such a bias beyond this, being a marketer, obviously.
This is true.
But I think the perspective of a marketer at a board table to bring a marketing kind of lens, but to be able to have the conversation around sort of many of the issues being discussed is really, really important. And I think even more so, we are spoilt for choice in our lives as consumers. And so actually really bringing a different perspective, or being able to sort of add some color perhaps to a P&L which is very black and white. I mean, it's either red or it's black ultimately, but to add that sort of color and the perspective of a sort of customer, and actually being the voice that says, is this the right thing to do?
Right.
You know, and thinking about that from a customer point of view of, in sort of relationships, it's how would you want to be treated? And so it's almost, for me, thinking about it in a more 360 way versus perhaps quite a sort of linear transactional way.
Right.
Because you ultimately do want either repeat purchase or to at least increase a kind of purchase cycle. And that might not happen within a time frame of like this quarter or this kind of year, but it's actually what can you do to ensure that you are higher up on that sort of choice when the time is right. And I think we certainly saw how brands responded quite differently in sort of COVID. And it'll be fascinating to see, which I'm sure we will in years to come, some of those case studies that actually come through about how, having done the right thing by customers during a really tough time for people's lives, actually how has that really sort of impacted revenue or engagement or whatever, valuations, whatever that might be.
Over the mid to long term.
Correct.
Yeah. No, I think it's a really good, really good reminder that just because you can't, I think we have these biases. I did a behavioral economics course recently, so I became much more familiar with all the biases that we have cognitively. And one of them is, if we don't see something in reporting and metrics and data, we just don't believe it. And I think you hit the nail on the head that it's being credible and convincing a boardroom that actually they should hold their nerve, and that there is lots of evidence that should you do these things and do them right, that it will come.
Yeah.
But not, to your point, to expect it in a matter of let alone days, weeks, months. Sometimes it can be years. Whereas this on-demand world where we get everything like at the click of an app, I think has created this expectation that marketing, you drop the money and then immediately within a 24-hour window, someone clicks and they buy. And of course, with some D2C products, that is true.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of brands, actually, it's a lot more complicated mental availability, like you say, the whole
totally. And the beautiful thing about people and humans is we're really unpredictable. And yet, actually, typically there is a level of predictability that clearly a business wants to see. Right. And, that's where I think in some respects, the focus on short-termism or using certain channels is because it gives you this very sort of linear predictability that is actually really reassuring. But the reality is that's not how we are wired as humans, or actually how we sort of work. And so it's always this kind of blend, for me, of actually having the right story and kind of reaching people in the right way. But it's not always going to kind of play out in a very linear fashion. And there's that sort of wonderful saying, isn't there, that not everything that matters can be measured. Or that,
I know the one you mean.
Yeah. I forget it exactly, but there is that sort of view that I think we just need to kind of course correct. But it's really, really sort of tough to do.
Yeah,
and for me, it is just having those conversations and being very, very clear on actually how do you bring together, as kind of Thomas Barter would kind of reference, the value creation zone. So how are you creating kind of value for the business and also creating value for the kind of customer, and where those two circles overlap, you absolutely want to be solely focusing there and stretching it. And I think if you can start to do that, then hopefully the trust and the respect builds.
Comes along.
And I think to that point, maybe actually collectively you can hold your nerve a little bit more, because marketing is always operating in the kind of future and yet to happen, versus so many other of our kind of functions are reporting on what has happened, and there is a certainty to that.
Yeah, no, that's very true. I mean, to some extent, I remember Rory said this in his interview, that there's a flaw and a bias in reporting on what's happened, because that isn't necessarily what's going to happen. I mean, we all know why we do it. But also you reminded me of an episode a few months ago with Matt Bushby from Just Eat, who said we had to convince the business to move from just expectation on a Saturday night, people would see something and buy, to a model of lead and lag measures where you can just see brand favorability ticking up, or you can see kind of interest moving forward. That's a good enough surrogate measure to show something's happening, because people like that comfort, that reassurance, to your point. But that doesn't mean that it has to be sales or ticket. Someone's bought a ticket or whatever that is.
Totally. And for me, the pandemic really kind of tore up any of the trends that had kind of previously gone before. And even certainly during my time at sort of Formula One, working with the kind of countries, there's obviously sort of previous trend data about how ticket sales have performed and, that side of it. I mean, macro environment went completely out the window. It's like, can people travel, or are flights going to be running? And I don't know, are COVID rules going to come back in? And so people weren't buying tickets like they'd previously bought tickets. And so they were leaving it much, much later as that changed sort of behavior. It didn't mean to say the demand wasn't there, massive demand there, even more actually. And people were spending more, but that wasn't predictable, because actually all of the macro environment had really, really changed.
No, I hear you. And it strikes me that one of the things you're saying, Ellie, is that no matter what is going on kind of on a macro level, actually there's certain behaviors and certain strategies that a senior marketer or marketing departments can stick to through any of that, because it's proven to work. And I know you mentioned Thomas Barter and the course I think you did with him and Sile about marketing masterclass. I'd love you to maybe share some of the insights that you got out of that in terms of when a CMO is doing strutting their stuff perfectly, what muscles are they actually exercising to really do it? Because as you said earlier, it's a really important role at the board table, because everyone else has a much more narrow role, and one that doesn't often get critiqued quite as much. You rarely sit with the CFO and say, well, I don't think you did those. I don't think those ratios look right. Whereas with marketing, everyone's got an opinion. So I'm just interested in like how you think about turning up as a CMO in a board.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, having left Formula One, learned a lot about myself. In the fact is, I'm really rubbish and not doing an awful lot. So I love to be busy and kind of occupied. And I actually took the opportunity whilst kind of in between sort of roles and sort of really reviewing what chapter 4 looks like for me to sign up and do the marketing leadership masterclass with Thomas and Sil. Now, I was really fortunate to have done the Marketing Academy Fellowship in 2020. So I had a real kind of taste of a lot of what is kind of clearly within the Marketing Leadership Masterclass. But I thought, you know what? 2 years on, the world has turned upside down. Brilliant time, refresh. I'm still finding some muscles and growing some muscles, and I hope that kind of continues. But I think what really resonated for me was absolutely the kind of focus around understanding you've obviously got relationships throughout. So the importance of clearly managing upwards, but within your kind of peer group, yourself and your energies, and obviously your kind of team. But the real sort of effectiveness comes through your sort of upwards and your kind of sideways. And clearly the real area to kind of focus and prioritize is absolutely on this value creation zone. And just having that sort of refresh, because I think the one symptom that I think every marketer will absolutely sort of empathize with is quite often a very, very long list that needs to be done. And quite often you will also kind of get a load of things kind of chucked in that everyone else would like you to do. And so really coming back to where are we prioritizing versus having a super long tail, where are we prioritizing and what's genuinely going to move a needle for a business? And that's where we're kind of going, and ensuring that you're constantly kind of communicating and actually getting the input from everyone around the business. So this is a shared outcome that we're all kind of pointing to. Is sort of hugely important. And then, you know, for me sort of personally, you referenced it sort of earlier, but even just, you know, when you're leading your teams, it's so important to empower them to set a clear sort of future direction and a vision and have those kind of relationships. But it's so important that they are continuing to develop and stretch themselves, and actually having the ability to know when to zoom in and zoom out of the detail, because quite frankly, you can't be across kind of everything. Absolutely. And I've certainly sort of been in positions and learned sort of over the years where you then will often become that kind of bottleneck because people are wanting your input, and it's almost kind of saying, no, these are the bits I'm going to come in on, keep me updated.
You don't need me.
I'm not here to kind of block stuff. My role is to really help to unlock and unblock so that we can really sort of deliver on things. And so it was a great kind of 12 weeks actually to sort of really bring back to life, and certainly to the forefront of my mind, sort of everything that we sort of covered in the sort of Marketing Academy Fellowship back in sort of 2020. So heaps and heaps of lessons and kind of guidance. But yeah, it's been good.
Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that, Ellie. Firstly, I think zoom in and zoom out is a great insight for anyone developing leader or leader, because I think it is one of those hugely valuable things. I think gone are the days where you just set the vision and then just expect people to you need to be able to get close enough to what people are actually doing and get involved in business. But to your point, a very, very valid and important point, not suffocate people so that they think that you're making all the decisions. And the other thing I love, which I think is a really strong message for people listening, is you're never finished learning.
No, never.
You can constantly keep adding into that, even if you're like, even Warren Buffett was continuing to learn right to the end of his career.
And I love that continuous learning. Like, I was never a super academic kind of theory-based person myself, but the learning on the sort of job, and even the continuous learning now of a lot of kind of reading or kind of courses whilst you're kind of working. And even just, I love having a team of just diverse backgrounds, kind of ages, specialisms, and actually the value that you get from other members in your team. Because yes, I can do the critical thinking and I can ask the right questions, but you know what? I don't have the level of expertise that a lot of the members in my teams have had. And so actually it's as much about me learning from them as hopefully I'm able to kind of inspire and sort of teach them. And that's actually, I think that's why I also find any of the sort of mentoring or sort of other bits that I do just so rewarding, because you're constantly in that.
It's the reverse element of it often, isn't it?
It's so sort of fantastic. And it's certainly one of the ways for me to really think about relevancy and just being kind of like aware of where a lot of kind of cultural trends are kind of moving to, or kind of really recognizing what's making different kind of cohorts tick and things I should be aware of. And that's so important for me, which I think, historically is also why I've always taken such value from working with agency partners and just kind of removing yourself from your bubble and putting yourself into kind of different situations. So your mind and your eyes are opened in different ways.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So you mentioned the word relevancy there, and I think we've talked about brand. You just talked about keeping a kind of eye on the different way that cohorts are changing and people are behaving. But there's obviously also been this huge shift towards data and kind of marketing, technology and automation, which I think the marketing industry resisted for quite a long time. Every other industry went through that enterprise technology kind of diversification. So I'd love to just change tact a little bit and get your view on how and where does that fit into kind of your view of how you do marketing. And I think you rightly said that you shouldn't become overly obsessed with it, but the way that you can reach customers and understand customers these days has dramatically changed, hasn't it? Yeah,
there is so much that data kind of provides. And I read a book by Rishad Tabakawala, which is about putting the soul back into kind of business. And he has, if anyone isn't sort of signed up, brilliant newsletter sort of Subtract. And he talks a lot about the maths and the meaning, and that for me is always the sort of head and the heart, or the art and the kind of science. And again, it's about an and versus an or. And I think we're so fortunate that there is far greater access to data. I think there's always a danger about having too much data, and actually quite often it is the insight and actually how you put the people with the data to really actually take out a very kind of clear narrative. But for me, it's about how do you use that data to shine a light and to provide you with the kind of path forward. But it's then a combination, I think, of experience and kind of intuition, and really sort of understanding what makes people tick, as to then actually how you can be creative and kind of craft with sort of data to show up in a way that's kind of relevant. And if I think back to my time at sort of Formula One, the data played such a kind of key role. but the data without the heart and the kind of creativity and the kind of craft wouldn't have landed in, I think, the way that we were able as a team to really start to kind of craft a new narrative and a perception for the sort of sport. And I think, you know, it's also being humble as a marketer. That actually we don't have any of the answers, but we can kind of look to data and past experiences and other people to really sort of craft what a narrative is. And how do we pull all of those kind of quite often disparate things together. And then you're a caretaker in a role quite often for these kind of brands or these companies that have existed for such a long time. And that again for me is like when you get it right, quite often you never forget your past and you never forget the essence or the DNA, but it's actually how you can use data, behavior, semiotics to really actually then hold on to those kind of core elements, but really kind of play it forward so that you're relevant for today and hopefully for tomorrow with the audiences that you want to have that connection with.
And beautifully articulated, Ellie. I think, like listening to you, like data overcomes that bias that a lot of marketers used to have around gut instinct, and that looks good, I think that's going to work. And I think you also talked about that the importance of diversity of thought in your team, and in agency partners, because with diversity of thought and different people, you need data infused into everything. But as you say, unless it feeds an action, if it's not action orientated, we all like a Tableau dashboard or a Google Data Studio dashboard, but unless it leads to something, I think that's part of the problem with a lot of the digital revolution. It's like, well, we've got all this data. Here's the report. Okay. So what does it actually tell me differently than I knew last week, other than my sales are up or down 5% based on paid media?
And you know, that's why I think, you know, the war on talent and actually the value in certain kind of roles, or where there is a real kind of shortage of data scientists, or actually sort of the people there that can really tell a story through data, is so sort of powerful. And I am certainly sort of always trying to find that balance between what does the data tell you, but also recognize that I think emotionally I'm really sensitive actually to kind of work, and it's very hard to articulate, but I think over sort of the last 22 years there is something inside that when you see an idea, and yes, you can evaluate it against your kind of audience or the job that it's there to do, but I'll still have that kind of gut feeling or a reaction where you're like, okay, are we onto something great here? And how do you then get the best out of your agencies by challenging each other to actually kind of make that better? And that I think is really important, to not lose that human side. But
no, I agree.
Again, it comes back to and, not or.
No, you're right. Maybe we need more data artists as well then, as data scientists. That connection. I mean, as you said a few times, like we're dealing with human behavior, and human behavior is complex. We've got a left side of the brain and we've got a right side of the brain, right? And different things are fired off at different times in the brains that lead people to do stuff. So it's not purely just about a rational thing half the time. So before we go off the topic of the data and technology, you've obviously spent a lot of time in the entertainment industry, and there's some quite interesting things happening in the streaming space. We're on the 15th of July today when we're recording this, just so people know, because it will go out a bit later. But Netflix is partnering with Microsoft, and Disney Plus is partnering with Trade Desk to sell its inventory through kind of exchanges. Like, what do you think that means? What's happening there?
I think it is the most exciting time, and it is an industry in a space that fascinates me kind of greatly. I think from a macro point of view, there is so much disruption on the sort of horizon, and there are some kind of trends that I think will come back through with kind of, we've been through a period of unbundling. Yes. I think, the streamers disrupted the kind of cable, and we're about to kind of mix it all up again. And I think we'll see a trend of rebundling, specifically on Netflix and Microsoft. Absolutely kind of fascinating in terms of actually how they start to look at clearly tiering. I think they obviously don't have the ad sales skills there.
No.
And so Microsoft have clearly got some real kind of expertise there. When you think about where else they could have gone, it feels it would have been really hard to have gone with a kind of Google or kind of Roku, because they're like direct competitors. Absolutely. I think it'd be really interesting from a marketing point of view, with churn being such a kind of challenge, I think amongst all those kind of platforms, coming back again to human behavior, actually, how many subs are people really going to have?
Right.
What drives subscription and those kind of daily valued habits of kind of sports or kind of news?
Yes.
And Netflix have an association with sports, but they don't have news and sports like actually all of your other players. And this is why I think it's going to be so interesting longer term to really sort of think about what does happen to sort of Netflix. And I think it's clearly full of seriously smart people.
Yeah.
And so they've got their kind of the immediate things we're aware of with clearly ad funded tiers for lower price point. Would love to see how, from a marketing point of view, pricing strategies and kind of churn evolve versus where they're already sort of super good from a content marketing perspective. It feels as if maybe there's a real opportunity to think about more sophisticated kind of longer term marketing from a churn and subs point of view.
That's interesting.
What I do think is really fascinating is when you actually look at some of the acquisitions that Netflix have made within the gaming space, and they've just started kind of testing that with almost, franchise gaming elements connected to obviously some of their superbly successful kind of original content. Is, we're seeing the first bit of a relationship that's being shared with the world between Netflix and Microsoft, but Microsoft is currently acquiring kind of Activision. They've got the Xbox, and so actually from a verticalization perspective, where does the future go between Netflix and kind of Microsoft? Because Netflix is taking a bet on gaming, and we're seeing those kind of acquisitions there. We know that gaming as a passion point or a vertical is more valuable than movies, and has been for a long time, but maybe hasn't had the kind of focus, or perhaps the kind of credibility.
And it's broadening out in terms of ages as well, isn't it? I mean, it's not massively. Just a young thing anymore.
No, it's not. And so you've got huge focus and an engagement within a particular audience, and you can while away hours gaming. Yeah. And actually, who doesn't want to have an engaged customer? So where it goes in the future, thinking about, Netflix, gaming, having Xbox, having the verticalization through hardware, software, IP, really, really interesting space. I obviously, unfortunately, cannot predict the future. But if I was in the shoes of Netflix or a kind of Microsoft, these are certainly, I think, some of the longer term strategies that I would be kind of playing out and thinking about alongside the sort of pricing strategies as well, just as that kind of market evolves and moves around. And another stat I read, I think this week, was that more search is now done on TikTok than like YouTube and Instagram or something. And I think that again is like TikTok has been this Trojan horse of like taking attention away from our existing kind of streamers. And an incredible kind of model where you've got all of these creators, and TikTok are essentially spending kind of little to nothing on creating kind of content. And then we got this kind of content war playing out amongst our streamers with sort of $120 billion being invested in making original content.
And their whole shoppable piece, a bit like Insta went to shopping that, like, as you say, once you've got attention and engagement, it's not too much of a leap to turn it to discovery and then to commerce.
I adore this space because it is so fast paced and exciting. And I think it's just rich for opportunity.
Well, they were fabulous insights. I would say, given your background, that's probably as good as crystal ball grazing as we're going to get. But
I don't know. That's kind of you to say. I don't know about that. Hopefully, a good chapter at Virgin Media on the subscription business, and then clearly kind of content and entertainment on sort of F1. Gives 10 years of at least passion. Yeah,
no, absolutely. And like zooming out again, I think it's fascinating. I mean, a lot of them are US-driven businesses, but they're global. The ones we've just talked about, and Disney's in that mix is like the almost like the content powerhouses on one side and the technology powerhouses on the other side. There are, I mean, Microsoft, not really kind of known particularly for content. Netflix, not really known for ad tech. And it's interesting, like these partnerships, and does this compete with a Google and an Apple in the long term if some of these companies can kind of join forces? And like Google's got YouTube, but interestingly, they haven't really made a massive play into content, even though they could have done. So I find, to your point, I find that whole content tech, entertainment, subscription, monetization, it's just a fascinating space, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's only going to continue to change with such sort of velocity.
Right.
I think it's really, really cool.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we could probably talk about this all day, but I'd love to kind of bring us to a bit of a close and like slightly change tact. What I always ask our guests to do at the end is kind of just talk about something that you're working on. I mean, I think you've already shown some kind of humility and vulnerability in some of the things you're learning and going back and studying stuff, but like, what is it that you're trying to get better at and spend time on developing?
Oh, there's a long list.
Honest.
a long list. For me, I think having this time sort of in between my sort of chapter 3 at Formula 1, from sort of 2017 to the start of 2022, and whatever my chapter 4 might be that I write, now for me is a real time to focus actually on me and to really sort of understand what makes me tick, where I get my energy from, and really sort of, I think, being clear on that. What I love is, what I really love is being able to inspire people, and particularly in kind of teams, to sort of really lift their gaze and imagine what's possible that, you can deliver for a business.
Yeah. And
understanding how to get the best out of people, and wherever they may be as a partner or inside an organization, is something I'm particularly sort of passionate about, I really care about. Yeah. And so there's been clear on what makes me tick, and there's also been kind of really clear on what have been the times or the experiences in my life where I've felt like real joy. Right. And what were those kind of ingredients, all those kind of situations? And for me, the ability to create, to positively kind of disrupt, to imagine kind of the what ifs, and actually how you grow brand. And I think that will always be sort of the path at which I've grown up from.
Yeah.
Of building and developing kind of brands and revitalizing or kind of transforming. And I think that's been the case with a sort of Honda and a Virgin Media and an F1. And so for me, as I think about where to kind of grow, it's been clear on what am I brilliant at?
Yeah.
What am I not brilliant at?
Mm-hmm.
But I think anyone in a sort of CMO and a leadership position, you will typically have quite a breadth. And so it's being aware of that to then make sure that I've always got experts within my team. And then actually we are better together than alone.
Yeah.
And that's what I've been kind of really spending my time thinking about.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I think your advice to people to introspect. I think when you get to those points, I remember I did it when I left Havas after being there for a long, long time. You sit there and you think, but if you can almost like encourage yourself to do some of that introspection that isn't always at those moments, more regularly, like you just said, I think that's a really powerful thing, because you do start to listen to yourself and what actually, as you said, energizes you, how you turn up in the best way. And I think for any younger budding marketers or agency people, try and do that sooner, because I think we can probably say that we would probably have wished we'd done that years ago, and it's difficult to get there unless you really get told to think that way earlier on.
Totally. And I did a marketing society marketing leadership program back in like 2012.
Yeah.
And there's a business coach called Steve Radcliffe who's written a book called Leadership Plain and Simple.
My favorite leadership book.
Me too. And I said to,
FED, right? FED.
Yeah, FED, the FED model. And I love eating, so it always sticks in my mind. But, you know, that's a book constantly on my bedside table. And actually, Ruth's book about marketing in the boardroom, Ruth Saunders' book.
Yeah.
But the FED model for me, and even just going back through that and having the time to really go back through and understand just how simple it can be, but how often it's complicated. And importantly, actually, you know, your iceberg, what comes across on top, but actually, you know, your values and kind of what makes you tick in the sort of hidden bits. Yes. And the energies is a massively sort of important one of your kind of physical energy or intellectual, emotional, and kind of spiritual.
Yeah.
And engagement ladders, all these kind of things that I've really valued, actually just having a bit of space to really kind of reconnect and step off that treadmill and almost kind of pull from the back of my mind what would have kind of been seeded or planted there, I think 10 years ago.
Many years ago. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's been brilliant.
No, it's really funny that we both love that. But whenever I mentor someone, I always say there's a lot of leadership waffle out there, stuff that you'll never really be able to apply, frameworks you can't understand, but this will stick in your head and you'll remember it. And most people get one of the three wrong. And if you could actually do, and your job is not to do all of the three, but it's to make sure that you're steering it and you've got people that can push it all the way through. So that's super interesting. Look, the only last thing I was going to ask you, Ellie, like just is there one single kind of pithy bit of advice that you would give to kind of budding marketeers or people listening?
Oh, well, I think having had this time of refreshing with Thomas and Sil, and actually I did the Mark Ritson mini MBA. As a true marketer, I'm not going to give you one, I'll give you two things, but they're related.
I'll let you.
Thank you. Absolutely find your value creation zone and learn the language of a business. And that will be slightly different on where you are, but leave the kind of marketing BS and a lot of our kind of metrics and language. Leave that well alone from the kind of boardroom and really understand what your company talks about in that language. And that will inevitably be profit, revenue, and, you know, that type of thing. Learn that, really understand it. And I think that goes a long way to building credibility, and don't get distracted from what's going to really drive value and move the needle.
Nice. And I think that's good. That's great advice for anybody in any part of this big marketing ad industry, like people at agencies, people in consultancies, people in vendors. Unless you understand the business that you're talking to and their challenges, then you're never going to be that valuable. You can't just go in and sell a product or service.
Yeah.
So, well, look, I've really loved this chat, Ellie. Thank you so much. You've left us with so many great things and take us on a real journey from the fact that building in brands, and particularly going into a recession, that kind of long-term kind of piece is so important. The balance between, I guess, kind of data and insight and kind of focus and kind of being creative. Also the and piece, just in general, like rather than either or. I'm also a big fan of that, because too many people, particularly in this industry, you argue one thing, somebody will go to the other. And we've got lots of industry bodies that go, no, TV's the best, no, digital's the best. It's like, well, come on, aren't you kind of almost the same thing these days? So, and you've also reminded us all to look inside ourselves and remember what makes us energized and gets us excited, and how we touch people and impact people. Because at the end of the day, no one remembers the PowerPoints that you wrote, do they?
No. How you left someone feeling, as Maya Angelou would say.
Exactly. Well, look, all that remains is for me to thank you, Ellie. Appreciate you coming on, and I'm sure our guests will have loved the conversation. So really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Paul. Good to see you, and stay cool this weekend.
Yes, we'll try.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Time for a Reset. I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. We'll be back talking to a senior marketeer very soon. Make sure you don't miss out on any new episodes by subscribing on Apple, Spotify or SoundCloud, and leave us a review at timeforareset.co.uk.